So tonight, what we're going to do is talk about arguments for the existence of God. And I'm going to get into science, and I don't want that to scare you away. This is kind of our long presentation. And some of you are already asking, can I get some of these books and resources? First of all, if you go to the website, which we have the QR code, pro.org, you'll see almost 2,000 articles there. The person that would be speaking this out, Dr. Ray Boland, has written many of the articles there. They're free of charge. For you students, that's exactly what you like to hear, right? Free of charge. Books are available as well. And I will also mention some booklets that are free of charge. We can send to you as a PDF. So we really want to give you a lot of material. Now, we have to charge for the books, but again, you'll see that those are fairly expensive. And if you are really wanting to learn these issues, if you really want to be able to do kind of evangelism and apologetics, what they're talking about, we really want to provide you with those resources. So let's, first of all, when we talk about we're going to have a separate presentation on arguments of the existence of God, but I kind of merged these two together. There are some classic arguments for the existence of God. And probably the way to illustrate that is maybe to tell the story of the Christian and the atheist. The Christian and the atheist just walked along the park here in Laredo, and they found a ball, and the Christian said, where the ball came from? He said, well, obviously it came from somewhere. So the Christian said to the atheist, so there's a cause. The atheist, well, of course the ball has a cause. So but that ball is 16 feet in diameter. Could that ball have a cause? The atheist said, oh, large small ball would have a cause, a larger ball would have a cause. He says, what if that ball is 1,600 miles in diameter? Would that ball have a cause? Atheist said, well, sure, a small ball would have a cause, a larger ball would have a cause. So then the Christian asked the atheist, well, what if that ball is the universe? Would that ball have a cause? The atheist pauses and says, no, actually, the universe has always existed, and it does not need a cause. You can see the problem because this is what is known as the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument is an argument of cause and effect. Why is this building here? It was built. Why are you here? You came in here. There was a cause that brought it about. Cause and effect, cause and effect. Ultimately, there must have been a first cause. And so you can see that one of the more powerful arguments is this idea of a cause, a first cause, or a first mover, a prime mover. Aristotle talked about that. And so that's kind of the argument of the ball. Just change it a little bit. Christian the atheist is walking a little bit further, and then across watch, and they're in the Christian says, I got a question for you. Question is that because we do have watch, but isn't this a watch that could have just spontaneously developed? I mean, after all, every element in that can be found on this planet. Isn't it possible that some maybe hurricane came down here, and in the created a watch. So it's ridiculous because there's too much information in a watch to explain it on the chance. Christian says precisely. That's the logical argument. Design argument. Because frankly, the Christian says you're not a information sinless cell in your body has more information than the kind of information necessary to watch. Christian atheist walking longer. Christian says, the idea of right and wrong. He said, it's really somebody's told you to have ideas, for example, the treachery is highest virtue. Well, we understand that all in nature, still, the idea that we have this concept of a moral law suggests that we have a moral giver, and that's the I'm going through this fairly just to illustrate that there are some very good arguments that we can use as Christians simply because there are common sense arguments as well. If you turn to your Bible, notice Romans 1 talks about the fact that certainly we live in where God's eternal power exists. And then goes on to say, and they are without excuse because the evidence of God is so evident. Or you can go to the Psalms, and it says the heavens declare the glory of God. So over the next couple of minutes, I want to try what we can do to see what science is telling us about this issue. But let's look at this middle one first of all, this idea of design. And for those of you that would like to have some more information, there's a book that I put together on arguments for the existence of God. In just a few minutes, we're going to talk about a biblical view of God and science. That's really kind of a Cliff Notes version of a book we're talking about. Remember Cliff Notes? Sometimes how do we get through high school? If we didn't have the Cliff Notes, those are the summaries of all of that. And so these are some resources we'll talk about. But let's talk about the design argument for just a minute, because we're going to use that throughout the evening. By the way, at the end, if you want to ask some questions, I'll see I can try to answer those, certainly. If it really gets difficult, we'll call Ray Boland by phone, call a friend. We'll see what we can do here. We're going to see if we can try to answer your questions. But the design argument comes from a man with the name William Neely. Here's one of the resources that he published. And he argued that in his book, Natural Theology, he really said that one of the most found arguments for the existence of God was design in nature. He argued that simply, if you were walking along and you found a stone, well, it's a natural object. You can explain that just in terms of a natural process in nature. But if you came across a watch, that would be different. Because a watch is a different category. And he suggests planning, craftsmanship, and beauty, and usefulness. A watch requires what? Watchmaker. Design implies the designer. I just mentioned a few minutes ago one individual of those atheists put on the screen. He actually has written a book called The Blind Watchmaker, because he's arguing, well, what you think is design is really a result of evolution. We're going to show you how wrong he was. But nevertheless, the argument of design is powerful, because that's what the Apostle Paul is saying in Romans 1. You can see it. You go out right now. You look around. Look at nature. You see something that suggests that God exists. Right? We have that sense. And so we're going to see if that really works out. And so for a minute, I'm going to actually mention a book. Dr. Ray Boland has done a week of radio programs on this book, because unless you have a good scientific background, you probably don't want to read this book. Although I suggest that if you have any trouble sleeping at night, just get the book, put it at your bedside, and just read it about a page or two, and you'll be out, because it is pretty tough sledding. But that's why I produced that little Cliff Notes book I'll mention in just a minute. But in this, Stephen Myers with the Discovery Institute suggests how we got to where we are today. When you talk about where did science come from, well, it came from Christians. I think it's pretty easy. Christian theologians refer to nature as kind of the book of nature. We have God's Word, and then we have God's Word. And the two come together. And they argue that as I mentioned just a minute ago, in Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. Have you ever been out on a camp and you maybe looked up and seen all the stars? You go, wow, that is incredible. Suggests Romans 1. When you look at nature, and you see that as well. And so they said nature was sort of like a clock, really suggesting that there was design in nature. And so the laws of nature were also talking about the existence of God. But as I pointed out, that middle world nature, that naturalism, talk about materialism, about this idea that eventually they rejected the idea of God. And so as a result, because they rejected the idea of God, by the end of the 19th century, coming into the 20th century, they had said, we need to get rid of this idea of God. Because first of all, Charles Darwin, with his book, The Origin of Species, from biology, told us where we came from. Karl Marx, in his writing, developed a secular eschatology, a secular view of the future, told us where we're going. And then Sigmund Freud with psychology told us what it was about the human condition. And so by the end of the 19th century, most rational people started saying, we don't have to believe in God, because these individuals have removed the idea of God. And as we went into the 20th century, it was the most secular century, which gave us World War I, gave us World War II, gave us all the Holocaust, gave us the communist purges and all the rest. One of the most decadent and deathly cultures and centuries we've ever had. But then we come to the original talk here was the universe and origin of life. What's so interesting as we came into the 20th century, the scientists began to do more scientific investigation. It came conclusions that was a little bit different than what the secular mind is able. Then, way to Aristotle, there was this idea that maybe the universe was eternal. It existed forever. You ever had a kid ask, maybe you've had this, maybe you've asked it yourself, well, who created God? Right? Ever heard that question? Well, if God is eternal, you don't have to say who created God, because God has always been there. Well, this is the secular kind of argument. If the universe always existed, then we don't have to talk about where did the universe come from. It's always been there. And so then we have belief. But if you read your Bible, we just talked about creation ex nihilo, it says that there was a beginning to the universe. Well, the scientists began to do some research. They came to the conclusion that the universe is not infinite. The universe is not eternal. We'll go into all the details, but real quickly, you had Edwin Hubble, who, as he was looking in his telescope, began to recognize that, for example, the galaxy, the Andromeda galaxy, is moving away from the other galaxies. It's shifted to the red spectrum, for those of you that have a scientific background. And so all of a sudden, it looked like the universe was expanding, which would suggest there was a time it was all together. And so that was something that was suggested. And then when they began to see it shifted the spectrum, it was moving away. One of the things I do is ministry called Day 4. Ministry called Day of Creation was about fourth day of creation. We have Star Watch parties. We can see those galaxies. We can see those. We can recognize the universe. We can recognize the universe expanding and moving from an initial explosion of some sort. And then we, of course, began to realize that, wait a minute, if the universe had a beginning, then that means it wasn't always here. And if the universe had a beginning, who brought it into being? Well, let's see. If we believe in the idea of cause and effect, the cause is always larger than the effect, so the cause would have to be bigger than the universe. The people that hold to the current theory, Big Bang, say that the universe created both space and time. Well, it'd have to be outside of space, so that'd be like supernatural. It'd have to be outside of time, it would have to be eternal. So it's an all-powerful, outside of material universe, eternal. Can you think of any possible categories there? And you can see why Robert Jastrow, who referred to himself as an agnostic, used to be at the Goddard Space Center there in Maryland. He wrote a book called God and the Astronomers. And in the last chapter before the epilogue, he said, for the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of inquiry, and he's about to conquer the highest peak. And as he pulls himself over the final peak, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. Do you love that? And it just illustrates the idea that have proposed a theory. It says the universe had a beginning. It says the universe had a beginning. I mentioned Carl Sagan last time. I went when Carl Sagan was alive to his speech. Carl Sagan was alive to his speech. One of the questions from the audience was, what happened under Sagan 5 minutes before the Big Bang? 5 minutes before the Big Bang. Where did it come from? Gave us an answer. Because indeed there is a cause. Indeed there has to be larger than the effect. It has to be larger than the outside of space. It has to be outside of space.
And outside also has to be obviously intelligent. It also has to be obviously intelligent.
Like the God of the Bible.
It sounds a lot like the God of the Bible.
And so you can see that even when we get to this issue of the origin of the universe, we certainly have a cause and effect argument. Let's go to that second argument. That's the design argument. And for the next couple of minutes, I'm going to say whether we look into the telescope in the far dimensions of space, or whether we look at a microscope in the small dimensions of space, we see evidence for intelligent design. One of the ways we can look at this comes from a very good book that I might recommend to you. Again, it's a little bit tough sledding, but it's written by Guillermo Gonzalez and Jay Richards. It's called Privileged Planet. Now, it turns out that Guillermo Gonzalez was watching a solar eclipse years ago. By the way, we had some solar eclipse here in Texas. There you go. You've seen it. So you know what it's like. You've seen it. And so you know what it's like. Solar eclipse. And so how do you get a solar eclipse? You have to have a light-bearing body. You have to have the platform. You have to have a platform. You have to have something that comes in front of it. And one of the things that Guillermo Gonzalez was thinking about, this is the only place in our solar system where you can have a perfect solar eclipse. That's been known for a long time. But it is kind of interesting. The reason we have is the distance from the sun to the Earth, from the sun to the Earth, and is 1 to the moon. Is 1/400, and the sun is 400 times. So you get every once in a while a perfect solar eclipse. Isn't that just an interesting coincidence? Guillermo Gonzalez said, well, maybe it's not. That might be a fingerprint. And so, interestingly enough, a lot of people who have held to that view, held to what's called the Copernican principle. Who is Copernicus? Well, Nicholas Copernicus is the individual that told us that the Earth rotates around the sun. Galileo said the same thing. And so the argument, not so much from Copernicus, but later followers, was there's nothing unique about planet Earth. It's just kind of insignificant. We used to think the Earth was the center of the universe. It's not even the center of the solar system. So it must be very insignificant. And as a matter of fact, Carl Sagan, who mentioned just a minute ago, wrote a book called The Pale Blue Planet, because when the Voyager satellite, the Voyager spacecraft, left our solar system, they turned around and looked at Earth. From a distance, you could just see this pale blue dot. And they said, see, it's just one. And they said, see, it's just one in one solar system. In a solar system that has a galaxy million, that has a stars, million, and it's just one of stars, millions, and maybe it's just one of millions, and maybe even millions of galaxies. There's nothing significant or unique about Gonzalez says. Yes, but as we begin to look at some of the facts, it suggests to us actually living in a very significant place in the universe, because the universe is just right. The solar system is just right. Earth is just right. And some scientists have even said that we live in a Goldilocks universe. Anybody remember Goldilocks and the Three Bears? Remember, one bowl of porridge was what? Too hot. One bowl of porridge was what? Too hot. One was too cold, and one bed was too hard. That's right. One bed was too soft, and one was too soft, and one was just right. We live in a just right. I won't go into all the details, but just give you some ideas of how significant this is. For example, the universe, for it to even exist, is on a finely tuned set of circumstances and parameters. Some people said it's like on a knife edge. Here's a different illustration. It's like you had just a room full of dials, and every dial is set just perfectly. A little bit to the left, a little bit to the right. You don't have a universe. The constant in equation for gravity. I'm not sure how many students I have here that have ever taken a physics class. I'm going to show that to you in just a minute. Even so, the constant for electromagnetism.
the ratio between the strong and weak nuclear force, even the ratio at the atomic level, the ratio between the proton and the electron, all all. Let me just take the one in gravity for just a minute. Let me just take the one in gravity for just a minute.
Steve is.
Those guys that have ever taken physics, lived to tell about it. Here's a constant for gravity. This gravitational constant has to be so exact, and it cannot vary by more than 1 in 10 to the 60th power. If you're not familiar with exponential notation, that's a 1 with 60 zeros going into the men's room. Okay? See where we are here? We're talking about a really big number. I'm talking about that's just one really big number. And that's just one of those.
As we then go look at the universe, we begin to see all sorts of beautiful patterns. Our day 4, oftentimes we'll have these star watch parties, and people, when they get to see the rings of Saturn and they see the red dot in Jupiter, which is now starting to shrink, interestingly enough, and a variety of other things. We've seen novas and supernovas and things like that. We see quite a bit. But let's just bring it back to planet Earth. Because again, Earth is just right. The size of Earth is just right. The distance of Earth from the sun is just right. Matter of fact, the axial tilt of the Earth is important for each one of us. Let's look at each one of those. The size of Earth is just right. Elon Musk, you know who he is. He keeps saying we want to try to colonize Mars. He's got a big problem because Mars got a big problem.
Is too small. Because Mars is gravity that we have here on Earth gives us the atmosphere we have here on Earth gives us the atmosphere. Mars would not keep the atmosphere there because it's too small. Atmosphere there because it's too small. So again, Earth, size of planet Earth, just right. Our planet, the location of where our Earth is just right. There is what is called a solar habitable zone. If the Earth was just even 5% closer, we would be too close to the gravitational pull of the sun, and it would keep us from rotating, and so one side would be too hot, one side would be too cold, and we would lose that. Also, of course, there would be all sorts of other difficulties. We were too far away, about 20%. We would also not be able to have habitable life. And so that is significant as well. And then the actual tilt, I won't go into all of that, but that is what gives us our seasons and allows us to have a much more temperate kind of climate that exists as well. The temperature is also protected by the actual magnetic waves around it, also had a few solar flares, which have actually given us the northern lights, which have actually given us the northern lights. We actually been able to see the Borealis and because of that. Borealis because of that. So there's so many things associated with Earth that allows us associated with Earth and that allows us to live just right. And all of them. We also have an enormous moon. We see some other moons in our solar system, but nothing like the moon we have here. There was a movie that came out recently suggested the moon was brought there by aliens. And I've heard people actually suggest that because it doesn't actually have anything like the other kinds of moons we have, but it gives us the tides and also allows us to have the kind of circular turn and rotation that we have all of the time. And so as a result, when we look at universe, we look at the Earth, or even in our own solar system, we see something else. In our solar system, first of all, we have these very large planets, Jupiter and Saturn. I just mentioned them a minute ago. But then in our own galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, we find that we're in a very significant place as well. Let's look at those. The first is simply this. Jupiter and Saturn are very important because they're huge planets. Both of them, especially Jupiter, because they have such a gravitational pull, they're almost like vacuum cleaners traveling around our solar system and attracting meteors and comets and things like that so they don't hit planet Earth. You've probably seen some movies, Armageddon type of movies, that when we get hit by one of those, it's not a positive experience. But more importantly, because of their gravitational pull, they also keep Earth in a circular orbit. If they were not there, we would eventually devolve into an elliptical orbit where we'd be too close to the sun twice a year, too far away from the sun twice a year. And so they have some tremendous benefits in keeping our circular orbit. But also, when we now look at our own galaxy, not only do we have what you might refer to, as we just talked about a minute ago, a solar habitable zone, we also located, according to Guillermo Gonzalez, in a galactic habitable zone. We're far enough away from some of the dangerous parts of the Milky Way, but we also are not where the spiral arms keep us from seeing, so we can actually begin to see other galaxies and other stars and things of that nature with our telescopes. And so again, some really powerful arguments being made as well. Matter of fact, Guillermo Gonzalez and others argue that really Earth is in the best place. Really, Earth is in the best place. Also in the best place to observe. Is also in the best place to observe. Isn't amazing? Essentially, God's creation. And so, what about this? There have been people. And so, what about this? Put together. There have been people trying to put together. And a book that just has come out by Lee Strobel. And a book that just has come out by Lee Strobel on apologetics. His latest book is on apologetics. His latest book is every second of every day. Because every second of 200 people ask the question on search engines. 200 people ask the question: Is God real? And so that's his God exists. In the spin section, so that's his book. But in the spin section, he pulls from one of the scientists the fact that right now scientists have come up with 816 parameters that have to be finely tuned. Again, we're back to Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Okay, it's just right. And so the probability, according to scientists who could not sign the doctrinal statement of this church, but secular scientists estimate that the probability of that is 1 with a 0, 1,054 zeros. That's going to take us all the way to Mexico, just about. And that is an enormous number. Would you agree? That would be amazing. Now, scientists know that. So they say, well, yeah, but we just got lucky. We just hit the cosmic block. You know, there's a book that's come out called The Rare Earth. And so they say, well, yeah, it's an enormous number, but yeah, we got a big universe. It's an enormous number, but it's at least a big universe. It's at least possible that somebody, let's do the math, the cosmic block. One of the things is how many stars in the universe. One of the things is how many stars in the universe. We know that an order of magnitude, we know 10 to the 22nd stars in the universe. 10 to the 22nd stars, there's one planet per star. So let's just, it comes from another book called The Fingerprints of God. And so you would just, multiply the two numbers together, 10 to the 1,054th power times 10 to the minus 22nd, or 10 to the 154, or divided by 10 to the 22nd power, and that's still 10 to the 1,032nd power. That's not like hitting the Texas lottery. That number is so big, it says that there shouldn't be any life-supporting planet in the universe. And I think it illustrates the case. There's less than 1 chance in 10 to the 1,032nd power that you find even one life-supporting body that would occur anywhere in the universe unless you invoke divine creation. I've said to my atheist friends, you're betting your eternal destiny on that number. You're saying that this all happened by chance. So who's the person that has the faith, and who is the person that has the facts?
Can I interrupt for just 1 second and say,
Yes.
And usually about twice a year, you'll see articles in the newspaper, whatever, about they found some planet that might have water, they have some planet that might be about the right temperature, but they totally ignored the other 118 different parameters that are required to support life as we know it. So they cast these things out. Oh, look, this is evidence that probably there's some life someplace else. If there is life someplace else, I guarantee you that means that there is a God, because there's no way it happened by accident.
Very good. Again, you might say, well, hey, I'd like to know something about that. Maybe you're not a scientific oriented about that. Do you know somebody? Maybe you're not atheist, scientific, agnostic, but do you know somebody who's an atheist, has a scientific background? Maybe a skeptic about getting this book, has a scientific background. I think about getting this book. Or you might say, Return to God. I can't read that, but I'd like to get the Cliff Notes version. I can't read that, but I'd like to get the Cliff Notes version, which I take that and some of the material I've mentioned from Lee Strobel, and it's in a very readable. And as I promised to some of the students here, if you want a PDF of that, you now have a way to contact me, don't you? Have the bookmarks, and so we can send that to you and you can read it, or I can send you a copy of that. Is that a good deal? And students like free, so you get free. Okay. Let's go on, because we're only talking about one half of this, and then I'll open up for some questions you got. When we look at the telescope in the 4 dimensions, we see evidence for intelligent design. Okay. When we look at our microscopes, we also see evidence for intelligent design. But we have to go back to Charles Darwin when he wrote the book, The Origin of Species, in the 19th century. And I think it's important to recognize that Charles Darwin did not know anything about genetics. That was developed by Mendel later on, Gregor Mendel. And so there are some very sophisticated arguments about irreducible complexity. I knew I was not going to use a word like that at 9 o'clock on a Friday night, so we'll ignore that. But let's just take something very simple. And that is, every living cell, advanced living cell, there are some that don't, but all the advanced living creatures have DNA, and they have a genetic code. And so evolutionists have tried to assume that the DNA code that's in every cell in your body, in the cells of all these living creatures and plants and other things around us, is a result of design without a designer. Is a result of design without a designer. Scientists began to unravel the structure of DNA. Scientists began to unravel the structure of DNA. Watson and Crick. Maybe you remember your biology classes, Watson and Crick. They began to understand that. Francis Crick began to unravel this idea that all this could have happened by chance. They began to unravel this idea that all this could have happened by chance. In the DNA, that these subunits like letters in the DNA of the alphabet are sort of like a digital code that you would have in computers, like a digital code that you would have. So some people have put it this way: just as you can have letters to create words, and words that create sentences, so you can take these little base pairs called nucleotides, and they eventually form genes. Just as sentences can create a book, and books in a library, you have genes creating chromosomes in a genome. Now I can get into it very scientifically, but let's use a simple answer. That is to recognize that we're really talking about a 4-letter code, A, T, C, G. And so just as you have 4 letters to the DNA alphabet, we have 26 letters to our alphabet, right? I don't know if I have any Scrabble players here, but if you've ever played Scrabble, you know you don't put the tiles on the floor, on the table, and then you arrange them. And maybe sometime you dumped them out, and your name came up. Well, if it did, your name is probably Bob or Sue. It's not Alejandro or Patricia, right? The lower the probability. You with me on that? And see, when you start thinking about even simple living cells, they have proteins that have 200. You have proteins that have 200 usually amino acids. And you've got hundreds of those. Or you have the DNA code of those. And you begin to recognize you have the DNA code. Because if you begin to recognize this doesn't work very well. We use a lot, because if you think about, when I talk about the DNA, we use a lot. Whenever I talk about a code, when I talk about DNA, we have a code. Whenever I talk about a code, you assume what? And one of the things I noticed when I was in graduate school And one of the things I noticed when I was in graduate school, this happened by chance. So they would use all of this happened by chance with language, but they would use words associated with language. DNA is what? Transcribed into RNA. RNA is translated into proteins. They just can't help themselves because they see there's too much design, there's too much intricacy to explain it, or too much intricacy to explain it up until now, letters of the alphabet. So I've used up until now letters of the alphabet.
Are supposedly pretty
One of
good
the
at.
other things
Although I'm
that
getting
Steve
older,
and I
is
are
doing supposedly pretty good at.
computers.
Although I'm getting older.
And what is so interesting is Richard Dawkins, who I just mentioned a few minutes ago. What is so interesting is Richard Dawkins, who I just mentioned a few minutes ago. In his book, River Out of Eden, said this uncannily, computer genes is Richard Dawkins, an atheist, a materialist, a humanist. So Richard Dawkins saying, yes, but when I look at the DNA code, it looks a lot like the code that you would actually write for a computer program. And so for those of us that have written computer programs, you know what happens when you make one mistake. Now again, we're, for instance, you probably know C++, but when I was doing it, we was doing Fortran, okay? But you make one mistake, I put it through, and I made one typo, and I had to do it all over again. That's what life is like. One mutation on your DNA, and that is the case. And so if it's like a computer code, let me quote someone else, Bill Gates. You know who Bill Gates is, the head of Microsoft? DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software we've ever created. He knows only so well up there in the state of Washington, when they're putting together code for those computers, that one mistake in the code for those computers,
It doesn't work.
that one mistake
says that in a sense, we
have
have
computer
says
code
that
at
in
the
a
level
sense,
of the cell.
we have
In DNA,
computer code
that
that
is
is
more
more
advanced
advanced
than
in
anything
DNA.
that Microsoft,
It is more advanced
programmers,
than
coders,
anything
that
that
Microsoft. So again, computer programmers, coders,
Who has the evidence?
Who has the faith?
So
again,
good question,
who
David.
has the evidence? So again, I think if you're looking for more information on intelligent design, one of these books on intelligent design is available there. Some of the booklets on there as well. I recommend, as I did just a few minutes ago, the Stephen Meyer book, The Return to the God Hypothesis, which is a little difficult to read, but a new book that has just come out by Lee Strobel, Is God Real? And so with that, before we go any further, let me see if I can try to answer some questions, because usually the science topic generates a lot. So who would like to ask a question tonight? An area of agreement or disagreement? Was it all very clear? But again, you probably have not heard this kind of argumentation before, because there are individuals posting material all the time saying science is disproven God. But if you think about this, this has become the return to the God hypothesis. We believed in God. By the end of the 19th century, many intelligent people thought we could explain the world without God. And now we see the return, once again, of the God hypothesis. Pretty powerful. Well, since you're waiting, one of the other arguments you might want to be familiar with is by Stephen Meyer. Go ahead, Christian.
Related to science and how general it is, how specific it can be as well. On your ministry's page, is there a discussion on AI ethics?
I have done a booklet on AI, and that is, I think, another area of very important issue. I got a new book that just came out called Discerning the Future. My first chapter is on transhumanism, which I haven't really explained yet, but the second chapter is on AI, which is part of transhumanism. The third was on genetic engineering, because I think the younger people here are going to have to address those issues. On the one hand, I guess everybody's looking forward to self-driving cars. I don't know if you are, but I know my wife will never get in a self-driving car. But, you know, and there are some ChatGPT and all sorts of great things from AI. Matter of fact, the cover of the book comes from AI. AI created the cover
of the book, interestingly enough, although it has some typos, so even readers make mistakes as we cover. But again, would we actually create such a supercomputer that it would eventually threaten us? And if you're familiar with things like The Matrix or Terminator, that's exactly the premise there. So there are people, including Bill Gates, who I just mentioned a minute ago, and others, Elon Musk, who have expressed some real concerns about AI. So yes, we have some material on the website right now. I did that one on transhumanism, so the whole week on transhumanism has some sections on it. I'm probably going to do a whole week of radio programs just on artificial intelligence, because I think that's going to be a big issue that Christians need to think about. And let me also recommend some other people. John Stonestreet, a good friend of this ministry, yesterday his article on Break was on artificial intelligence. So there are some Christians writing about this topic as well. So very good question. Any others? So, well, let me just end with one other thing, and that is, you might say, okay, well, let me just end with one other thing, and that is, you might say, how do they respond? Well, have people, and they say, that are secularists, of course, how do they respond? It's very improbable that any life force, and any life-supporting planet, any habitable planet could exist. Life-supporting planet, maybe habitable planet could exist, or to the multiverse. Maybe that's so again, I might recommend the multiverse that we just mentioned. And so again, I might recommend the book section that we just mentioned. Again, you can see some of the arrogance of science, because I want to give you some again, you can see some of the arrogance of the science. Because over the past 500 years, the progress of science has worked to strip away God's role in the world. Don't you love that? Haven't you just paid any attention to what's been unfolding in the last century? But nevertheless, that's the case. Stephen Hawking, you know who he is. In his book, The Grand Design, he talks about M theory, predicts that a great many universes were created out of nothing. First of all, can you believe a scientist saying that universes were created out of nothing? So somehow the cosmological argument doesn't work for a universe. But nevertheless, the creation does not require the intervention of some supreme beings or God. Rather, these multi-universes arise naturally from physical law. There are a lot of good reasons to reject that, not the least of which is this idea of there being multiple universes without any observational basis. It's like the individuals that have said, well, life could not have evolved on this planet, so it must have been brought by ancient astronauts, either accidentally, off the boot of an ancient astronaut, or the seeded life, panspermia, but that is the case. But do we see this in the movies? Yes. Anybody seen the multiverse? Again, you remember the idea there that was being expressed by Dr. Strange in the multiverse. You're being given the argument that these ideas are being promoted. So again, the point I'm making so many times is that when we look at the world around us, there is always an attempt, even when you go to the movie theater and watch Doctor Strange in the multiverse. Even when you go to the movie theater and watch Doctor Strange in the multiverse, it's important to get a heavy dose as I started this evening with Colossians 2:8. Important to be careful that as I started this evening with Colossians 2:8. Be careful that no one takes you